So welcome back, everyone. We're going to go ahead and dive into a call to action led by our AAAS IUSE Advisory Board members, Dr. Ann Austin, Dr. Sandra Laursen, Dr. Marco Molinaro, and Dr. Kent Wallace. Dr. Austin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Iris, and thanks to all your colleagues, to Jennifer and others who have developed this absolutely wonderful afternoon of conversations and 2 weeks of conversations. We have a half an hour together for some discussion, and we have three wonderful colleagues that I would like to just introduce very briefly. And just before I do that, I'd really like to thank David Asai and then our colleagues, Christine Grant, Antari Stallings, and Zakia Wilson-Kennedy. I know those sessions were very lively. The one I was in I thought was terrific, and I heard others saying the same thing. As we move now to this half hour, let me introduce first Dr. Bryan Kent Wallace, who goes by Kent. And Dr. Wallace is at Fisk University, where he is in physics, the disciplinary coordinator, and also the director of the physics labs, and coordinator of rocketry. I particularly like that title because I don't get to say that very often when I introduce people. We're so glad that you, Kent, are here today. Then I'd like to introduce my colleague, Sandra Laursen, with whom I work very closely often. So it's always a pleasure to work with Sandra. She is a senior researcher and director of ethnography and evaluation research at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And I'd also like to introduce Dr. Marco Molinaro, who is at UC Davis. And Marco is the Assistant Vice Provost for Educational Effectiveness and the Director for the Center of Educational Effectiveness at UC Davis. I think many of us know these colleagues. If you don't, I'm not going to go into lots of detail of each one because we want to talk together, but I did want to say that each of them is very known for their innovative thinking, for the contributions they've made in terms of reform in STEM education, and for their commitment to the issues that we're especially talking about today around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and our students, our faculty, and our staff in STEM education. So I'm very honored to be part of this panel with these three colleagues. What we're going to do is talk together about several questions that I'll be posing for our panel. And I wanted to start out just by saying myself that, to remind us that the title of our whole afternoon together is Developing a New Faculty Model to Improve Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And it has the secondary title of A Call to Action, which is really what we're talking about today. And I think we began, of course, hearing from our colleague David Asai. I found it was a fascinating talk. And I noticed a few things. He reminded us that many of us often have terrific ideas, and then we're in a meeting like this or a conference, and we get back to our campuses, and business as usual overtakes us, understandably. And business as usual nowadays, for most of us, it means a very full and a very long day. And he was really challenging us, I thought, in a very specific way to say, not just abstractly, let's find some time to tackle these issues, especially around changing the culture concerning equity and inclusion. I thought he was challenging us in a very specific way. Here are some ways to actually go about doing that. And he gave us some examples. And I think in the sessions we just heard in the last 45 minutes, we probably all heard some very specific examples of what actions we might be taking as we think about new models, especially for faculty, to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I wanted to begin with a question to our panelists to ask them to think fairly specifically. If we're creating a call for action, what might be 2 or 3 actions that you would, or one, if you like, specific actions that you may be advocating yourself or have heard today that you'd really like to elevate so that we're really thinking about them as we go back out into our daily lives. And I think I'm going to rotate around as I ask people to get going, but maybe Marco, I'll start with you, if you might give us an idea or two.
Thank you very much, Anne, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to actually give you like 3 that I've been thinking of, and they have various time spans. The first one is something that Danter brought up that I thought was really, really important, and that is to kind of shift the thinking about underrepresented people of color joining our ranks in graduate schools and as faculty. And that is really about thinking, how do we get them to opt in rather than having all this thought about them dropping out? We shouldn't be thinking of a leaky pipeline, we'll be thinking of a ladder of opportunities and what's keeping our underrepresented people of color from opting in and actually wanting to be part of this enterprise. So I thought that was a good kind of way of framing these issues. The next one is really riffing off of David and Dunter. And I think from the things I've experienced and seen, can we create time where departments will focus on these issues, and maybe a concrete first way or first step in a call to action is really to focus on a climate survey that's run by an external entity like Oxide or Sea Change, that's trying to really understand what is happening from the perspective of the faculty, the graduate students, the postdocs, and the staff, I would say is also really critically important. I would even go as far as add undergraduate students that are majoring in the field, though I know that's not part of what Oxide does. But maybe having that be the first step, taking some time as a department to really look at those results and question what are we seeing in combination with some quantitative data, which I know and love very much related to working with departments as well. The last one I'll bring up is really something I've seen adapted from University of Michigan that we've adapted here at UC Davis. And that is really this idea that faculty that act on search committees have to be trained on DEI issues, especially implicit biases, and also the use of rubrics that try to be very concrete about how the candidates are being evaluated. So that is really a great way to train your faculty involved in these hires, while at the same time potentially combining that with this idea of targets of excellence or having open searches that allow you to not be hyper-focused on just the latest specific nanotech focused biotechnology biochemist who focuses on oxides. Don't make these hyper focused searches, but really have a broader search that's available when the candidate is there, so they don't get trapped by industry and grabbed by industry. They actually have the opportunity to come and be attracted by our abilities. So I'll leave it at those three calls.
Marco, thanks so much for getting us going and just elevating some very specific ideas. I'm going to go to Kent next, but you may not notice in the chat that someone commended your owl, Marco, in your background too. So it's good to be able to look at your owl too. And Kent, why don't you go ahead, then I'll ask Sandra, and then I'll ask if you'd like to comment on each other's ideas too. Kent, what would you advise us that we really elevate and keep in front of our sites right now as action items?
Well, I would look at this from a 30,000-foot level and more of a tactical in the trenches level. And it expounds upon what Marco had mentioned about training faculty in DEIA. Because from being a reviewer on proposals, working with universities and having these discussions, I think one thing is very, you think it's understood, but it's not, and that's what is diversity? I mean, what is diversity and when do you know that you have it? What does it look like? But then the other big problem I think exists is that people at certain institutions and in grants treat like the NSF has a diversity requirement or NASA has a diversity requirement or the DOE, they treat it as a checkbox issue. And you're never going to make any progress when your understanding or your view of diversity is checkbox. Oh, we have some people of color. Next. It just doesn't do its service. Secondly, when we think of diversity, there's a stereotype that you might be thinking of African-American. But as an African-American, you might be stuck in that, not realizing that that could also mean Latino or Asian, or what really gets, missed in the mix is indigenous. So just having an understanding of what diversity is and understanding why equity, inclusion, and accessibility are an integral part of making that whole thing work. So that's at the broad level. And at the tactical level, I believe it's to have conversations. And I've mentioned this in our meetings. We have to be willing to have uncomfortable conversations because when, as Marco mentioned, implicit biases, these systems exist because people perpetuate them. And for people to perpetuate them and you want to change it, then you're going to have to do some self-reflection. And then sometimes people get defensive because they don't want to be the one who's thought of in that vein. So we have to be prepared to get uncomfortable. because I think that the longer range goal is advantageous. And one last thing I'll say at the 30,000 foot level, institutions have to want it. It's an institutional culture, and you can talk the talk, but whether you want it or not is going to be evident in your actions. So I think at the very core of everything, institutions have to want it, and then things can happen.
Commitment, you're talking about. Ken, thank you so much. Sandra, let's turn to you.
I have been reflecting in the sessions on David Asai's comment about we need time. And on the one hand, I agree with him, and on the other hand, I would reframe that as saying what we make time for is what we value most. And so that this shows us a need to shift institutional values and priorities. And that means, making this a more urgent and more important issue. And so that to me says we need to change reward systems. And one of the reactions people have when we talk about that is to say, well, that's a really big project and a hard project, and it's not just something we do locally. So I've been thinking today about how we might get started, actions we might take that might help us start to move the reward system. And one thing I think is, to begin that work now, that's certainly one, right? The second best time to plant a tree is today, right? The first best time is 20 years ago, 50 years ago. But also I think things like elevating colleagues for a variety of kinds of scholarly and teaching and leadership work. So publicizing that work and sharing it on your department website or your college website, making sure you are good at sending off a note to the press office to get some press coverage of various and diverse kinds of accomplishments of the faculty. I think initiating or submitting people's names for institutional awards for all the kinds of work that faculty do. Again, recognizing the value in diversity and elevating that, celebrating people in your department for those things. And so those are the kinds of things that I think start shifting the curve of what we recognize as scholarship, a broader range of scholarships, a broader range of accomplishments in teaching, and elevating service work to leadership, recognizing that sometimes service is service, right? Stuff needs to get done, there's housekeeping. But a lot of the kinds of work we label as service and devalue is also leadership. And doing things that are important in the institution. And so that's another way I think we could start to shift that conversation about rewards.
Thanks so much to each of you for these initial comments. I really wanted us to be able to be thinking about some very specific actions and not linger just in the general commitment we have. So I appreciate these. I wanted to highlight, Sandra, the attention you just brought to the notion of elevating service to leadership. I've been hearing, interestingly, in the last several weeks in multiple meetings, and I think it's really something for us to think about quite a lot. Thank you very much for bringing that out. A question that I'd like to raise, first of all, I'd like to ask if you'd like to comment on any of each other's comments. Let me ask that, and you can be thinking. Where I'd like to go is actually, it's a question I did not ask you to prepare for, but it relates right here. And it came up in some of the breakouts that we had a few minutes ago. And that is, as we're thinking about these ideas you put forth, how do we think about faculty across all appointment types? We oftentimes, if we think about reward systems or we say the faculty, some of us may mean the tenure stream faculty, but I think many of us are increasingly committed to recognizing our faculty across the country hold many different appointment types. Some in the session I was just in with Christine Grant a few minutes ago, we were acknowledging different terms like continuing faculty, professional faculty. But how do some of the suggestions we're making help us really embrace our full range of faculty? I'd like us to bring forward here. Just before we get into that, though, I did want to ask if any of you wanted to build on anything a colleague had just said. I want to give you that opportunity.
Go
right ahead.
My mic is actually on this time. And
yay, good.
That you bring that up, and I'm sure my other panelists will have much to say. So I'll speak of a very specific thing, because I really do agree with this idea that there needs to be a positive way of expressing faculty whom are not necessarily tenure track, but are a part of this body politic. I remember I was visiting a graduation of a friend of mine who was getting her doctorate. And at this university, it was really interesting that at their graduation, before they confer degrees, give an award to the best adjunct faculty every year. All of my years, which is now 22 years of higher education, never heard of a time where they gave an award to an adjunct. And adjunct universities can't operate without adjuncts. They are actually very valuable. And I thought it was really nice to give the adjuncts something to work for and feel rewarded and feel valued. And so I'll use my time just to highlight, it is those little things that add up to a very, very positive culture that can lend itself to changing the way we imagine the tenure process.
Thanks for that wonderful point. I love it, that it's all those little things that add up a whole lot. Thank you, Kent. Sandra or Marco, before we move on, would either of you like to comment on anything a colleague had said in this panel a few minutes ago, or anything about, thinking inclusively about all our faculty? I want to give you a chance to respond to that before I move us to a different area. Either if you like to, and it's fine if you don't.
So I would like to say about the different levels of our faculty, with the adjuncts. We have lecturers, we have professors of teaching, and we have traditional ladder rank faculty. And one of the things I found really disturbing is that how teaching is evaluated is different in each of those categories. And I don't understand how good teaching is different based on your title. So I would like the language to be consistent in how teaching is evaluated, how service is evaluated, and how research is evaluated. Just change what the expectations are for each of those titles. If you expect more teaching, say that you expect more teaching. But quality teaching is still quality teaching. It's not like a faculty member's quality teaching is command of the room, whereas a professor of teaching, quality teaching is meant, 8 different factors that they have to look at. So be consistent in how you evaluate these things. So to me, that's a really key element to making sure that we have an inclusive environment. If we're using the same definitions and then clarifying expectations.
Yeah, appreciate the specificity of that comment too. It's an actionable kind of suggestion. Well, let me, I want each of you, if you have a thought that relates to something that's already been said, to feel free to link into that. But let me put another question on the table for us. I'm keeping my eye on how fast a half an hour goes too. I think all of us are well aware that we've been through for the last year and a half, particularly demanding times. Certainly the public health issues have been incredibly demanding. And as a country and as individuals in different ways, people have, we've all been grappling with, in a positive way, the growing recognition of questions about what does it mean to be a country that truly recognizes the diversity of the people who live here. And of course, it's been punctuated by the devastating events such as the George Floyd murder. In the context of this, I think in some of the conversations earlier today, people were saying, there's been such good, it's been such devastation, but also we've learned a lot in higher education. We've made some positive steps forward, especially around the topic that we're dealing with today, a new faculty model to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as we might think about what some of those positive steps are and how do we keep the momentum going? How do we not go back, sort of, people often say our eagerness to go back to normal. I think more and more people are saying, what's the next or the new normal? But in that, how do we learn from what we've been experiencing? How do we build on that as leverage for moving forward? I think what I'm really saying is we're in a particular moment in time that may actually help us to move forward around the issues of equity and inclusion we're talking about today. Would any of you like to comment on this moment of time, what we might learn from it, and how we might really leverage it to go forward right now?
Well, I'll jump in.
Please do.
I look at it from a perspective of, well, for you to appreciate what good has happened, you have to have a frame of reference of what was good and what was bad.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about what is motivations to keep it going, well, there's the view that I would have as an African American, and then there's a view that one would have as white male. And so as an African-American, you could argue that I might have more to risk if it goes back to the way it was than the white male. And so again, uncomfortable conversation. And so having conversations about what has changed, what is bad, because those are relative terms. And then, because usually most people who are in the power structure that benefits them will ask, well, what's in it for me? Then let's have the conversations of why is it good for you to have a more diverse, equitable campus? How does that benefit you as an individual, even if you may not be part of that quote unquote diverse population? So I like to frame it how, because sometimes, and I'm just being real, sometimes people look at it as a pie, and if I give somebody else a bigger slice, my slice is smaller, and you have to get them out of that way of thinking. Then it's like a sum zero game. You just have to show this is how our institution is better. This is how you are better by having things not go back to the way they were. And I feel that gets you more buy-in to have more people at the table wanting to move the needle.
You're talking about a reframing even of the question of why should these issues we're talking about of inclusion, of diversity, of equity matter, not just to individuals, which will enable some who have been privileged to resist, but why should this matter to all of us? Is that partly what you're saying, Ken? Am I understanding you?
Yeah, exactly. I think it is because, sometimes the problem is the question. And so really reframing the question so that you're getting at the heart of things and seeing how it's beneficial to everyone. Because at the end of the day, I look at higher education as this: the most important person in the building is the students.
Yeah.
Because without them, there would be no higher education, or you just have graduate schools that do research. So look at it from the broader base of how does this improve the quality of the people that our institutions are turning out, and how they will be a positive contributor to society, making our country, our world better. And if you can frame it like that, then you can get into the details of how that sums to that end result.
Thank you so much. Sandra, would you like to weigh in on sort of this moment in time, how we might leverage it, or the particular challenges?
I think one way I can see is that, it's riffing off of Kent's comment, which is if the most valuable people in the room are students, our institutions certainly had a big wake-up call about that this year, right? When students were voting with their feet about whether to stay in college or not. And so I hope someone's doing this work of studying what made students stay or go this year in a rough year for them. And of course, the personal challenges and things we were all facing in various ways. But I also wonder, what was the role of a committed teacher in keeping people connected to the institution and to their major and to their classwork? And I would be willing to bet that was significant for many individuals. And that also speaks to what we were talking about a moment ago about the importance of teaching focused faculty in our institutions, that those connections, feeling valued, feeling like someone saw them, even over a Zoom camera, was important this last year. I also think that, one thing I very much hope sticks around, or that we've learned from this, is that we've always said before with conferences and events and meetings and so on, that we couldn't offer people ways to dial in remotely and connect to gatherings in person. And we don't have that excuse anymore. We've learned how to do it. Some of us have gotten quite good at having interactive sessions like this one. And so I think now we can never go back. And I really hope we don't, because it's going to be important for accessibility, for cutting our travel and our carbon footprints, and for staying connected with colleagues across growing geographic distances globally. I gave a talk this week to colleagues in Israel. I had to get up really early in the morning to do it, but it was really cool to be able to visit with them. So I hope that stays. I hope that's a lesson learned.
We've gotten a touch of some of the possibilities, I think. One of my favorite quotes coming out of the pandemic, it happened very early on, was a colleague who said, well, we learned in 3 days that we could make some major changes and serve our students online. It would have taken us 10 years otherwise. And that quote has stayed in my mind and you're kind of speaking to that. We've gone far beyond what we were doing a year and a half ago. We've learned so much. Marco, what's your thought about this kind of moment in time and building on thoughts that Kent or Sandra may have expressed?
Well, so first of all, I agree with what I heard from all three of you that have just mentioned. I think the thing I would add is that I've seen it in classrooms, I've seen it in department meetings, I've seen it in leadership meetings. Actually, it seems like in this Zoom world, more people get the chance to contribute, whether it's via having a moment where they can speak or by putting comments in the chat. Having that dual modality seems to allow more voices to come out. And we have seen it very specifically in courses. Now, some faculty are better at encouraging this than others, but I've also seen it in department meetings. I've seen it in other settings. So I think that's a really nice thing that we've learned. It also means that people can't really say, well, no, I can't get to the department meeting because I'm 15 minutes away in this other building. No, now you just flip it on and you're there. You don't, the excuses for missing an important meeting with a group of colleagues is much harder, I think, right now. There is a little bit of overload from not having any breaks for those 15 minutes of travel. But the other thing is we've really seen a lot of flexibility in thinking about assessment and also just thinking about what it means to learn in a course or in a program, like how you evaluate that, but also it seems to be facilitating rethinking of core curricula in different departments. So that's been really quite exciting, and I hope that that stays. I have seen a barrier that I felt really strongly here as our quarter just ended about 2 weeks ago, and that was exhaustion. So people really feel like they spent so much time thinking about their teaching and interacting with folks in this way that they want some normalcy in some sense. They want some connection with people, but they also are worried about their own research, R1 enterprise, and in their lab moving forward. And so I've heard some of our STEM faculty specifically really saying, I need to stop thinking about teaching and get back to my research. I got to rebuild that. I got to get more grants. I got to focus on that. So it's going to be an interesting challenge of how we get that kind of innovation in teaching to stay there and be still some part of the conversation, while also enabling their research enterprise to continue. And maybe melding the two is one of the solutions, like trying to get more of that educational research to happen within their portfolios.
And also, I think building on what you were saying about this notion of exhaustion and burnout, you know, many of us have been thinking in new ways, I think promising ways about what equity means for our learners, what equity means, as we've been talking today, for our faculty. And, you know, as people are overloaded, sometimes things can fall off the plate. So how do we keep that at the front of our thinking too, I think is going to be important. I know we have to wrap up in just a moment. I was hoping that we would have the chance to talk a little bit about systemic approaches to change, to the kinds of change that we want. And I also noticed, I believe it was David Asai who used the term reimagining the STEM ecosystem. I wondered, just as we wrap up here, literally in the last minute or two, if any of you would like to make a very brief observation or thought about the notion of the challenge of systemic change and of being aware of the whole ecosystem that we work in. This is obviously a very large question, and I'm asking if you just had any wrap-up thought to be a tantalizer that we can all take forward as we continue to think about these ideas. Would any of you like to make a brief comment?
I'll make my brief comment is this. Tenure basically came from the AEUP in 1915. This process, which in that date would tell you, this was a process that was created by white males and that privilege. And so when you think about reimagining, think about when it was created and its processes, and think about now and realizing those two models and ways of thinking are different. And it's in that alone should say, it doesn't have to be the way that it was. So let's reimagine it. Let's think of how it could be more beneficial in the context of the era that we are living in and go from there.
Thank you so much, Kent. Sandra, Marco, would you like to, I realize this is a very big question, you may want to pass, but I did want to give you an opportunity if you wanted to say anything about reimagining or systemic change.
I think systemic change sounds a little scary because it sounds bigger than what we can do by ourselves. And so I would offer this, that we are all part of a system and we have some kind of leverage standing wherever we stand in that system. And if we're not the people who can make the grand decisions and move all the puppets, we are at least people who can start talking to people, use our advocacy skills, ask questions, be curious. And I think we all do have power of different kinds. We have power of influence and we have power of modeling and we have power of advocacy. even if we don't have formal political power, and we can get there someday.
Thank you very much.
I'll just very briefly add, it's really critical in my mind to include many voices in what in thinking about the change and thinking about what change you want to make. And I really want to make a plug for students, involving students and helping us think through this, because they're the, again, I agree with you, Kent, we're there for them. You know, that they're really critical to our enterprise and our higher educational system. I'll leave it at that.
Let me then, as we literally wrap up here, thank each of you. This was, I think, a very engaging and stimulating and encouraging half hour. I mean, I leave with thinking about some very specific ideas that each of you offered. I wanted us to really be able to offer up some things that are actions, you know, calls for actions. But I think I also leave with Kent's words ringing in my mind, these hard conversations we have to have. With Sandra's words just now, that we have the opportunity to dig or climb, whichever metaphor we prefer, where we stand and make a difference wherever we are. And Marco, with your words that the students really matter and need to be engaged with us, and they are our future too. So with that, let me thank you each so much for thinking together. It's been a privilege for me, and I hope that everyone assembled here today, I'm sure, is inspired by the ideas you've shared. And with that, I think I'd like to turn it back to Iris, who will take us to the next part of the afternoon. Thanks, my colleagues.